Today, we are in Wheeling, West Virginia, at the site of the Wheeling slave auction block. It was America's original sin, and families were broken up never to see each other again on this site. West Virginia's slave population peaked in 1850 with 20,428 enslaved people, or nearly 7% of the population, with 247 enslaved people in the northern panhandle. Because the narrow river valley did not support large plantations, most of Wheeling's enslaved people were domestic servants, working as carriage drivers, butlers, maids, cooks, or children's nurses. Wheeling's first white settler, Ebenezer Zane, owned slaves, including one man who went by the name Daddy Sam, who helped fight off the two sieges of Fort Henry in 1777 and 1782. Most of the prominent families that streets and neighborhoods were named after were slaveholders. Wheeling newspapers criticized the activities of Ohio humane societies and their support for runaway slaves. The Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, until 1856 when it was bought by a Republican, routinely printed articles defending slavery and attacking abolitionism. City and county codes often made participation in slave patrols mandatory for white people, even non-slaveholders. These patrols were to stop escaping slaves and suppress any kind of uprising. Lincoln schoolteacher Mrs. Dorothy Cooper wrote that at the corner of 11th and Chaplain Streets, a whipping post stood. Squire McConnell had charge of this, and administered punishment to all slaves who had committed offenses. Virginia was the biggest exporter of slaves for sale, which they considered their largest cash crop. Weekly slave auctions were held in Wheeling, and Wheeling became a major regional hub for hiring or selling enslaved people to the salt industry in the Kanawha Valley and to markets in the lower South. This was due to the convergence of the National Road, B&O Railroad, and the Ohio River. Slave coffles were frequent sights in West Virginia. These were groups of enslaved people, usually bound together by rope, that were moved mostly overland to markets in the lower South. Benjamin Lundy, a Quaker from Mount Pleasant, witnessed the slave auction, and that experience transformed him into a staunch abolitionist. He wrote about seeing droves of a dozen or 20 ragged men chained together and driven through the streets, bareheaded and barefooted in mud and snow, by the remorseless soul sellers with horsewhips and bludgeons in their hands. John Salisbury Cochran, an Ohio Civil War veteran and judge, was an eyewitness to the Wheeling slave auction block in 1851 as a 10-year-old boy. He described it as, "The auction block was on the west side of the upper end of the market, about where the city scales are now located. It was a wooden movable platform, about 2.5 feet high and 6 feet square, approached by some 3 or 4 steps. A bell that can be seen at Ogilvy Mansion Museum was rung to call people to the auction." Richard Naylor, a freeman in Ohio, would often come and pretend he was drunk, and would slip to the people held at the block on how to escape through the Underground Railroad across the river. Eventually, Naylor aroused suspicion and had to leave for Canada for his own safety. Judge John Salisbury Cochran, in his book Bonnie Belmont, wrote about an enslaved woman named Aunt Tilda that he witnessed on the auction block. The man walked up on the platform. In a rough manner, he caught the lips of the woman and, pulling them apart, took a thorough survey of her teeth and mouth. His grasp slipped, and she closed her mouth. He ordered her to open her mouth again, which she did, and then he actually ran his finger into it to feel her back grinders, as he termed it. Blood mounted to her cheeks at this indignity, but in a moment she regained her composure, and flushed cheeks gave way to a sad look of resignation. He took hold of her arms and punched her in the side and back to see how fleshy she was. He then looked at her hands. They seemed soft and tender. "Oh, she's a damned house servant," he said. "I don't want her. She'd be of no account in my hemp fields in Mississippi." Aunt Tilda's story does have a happy ending, although most did not. She was sold to a Quaker for $120, who freed her immediately. Her son and daughter was also on the auction block with her. Her daughter was freed forcibly by Underground Railroad workers from Ohio, and the son jumped off a boat in the Ohio River and swam to shore. Within a few days, they were all reunited. The last enslaved person returned under the Fugitive Slave Act was Sarah Bagby, who was returned to her enslaver in Wheeling on January 24th, 1861. She was freed during the war and moved to Pittsburgh, where she married a Civil War veteran, and then they moved to Cleveland.